Donald Trump has called off plans to sign a new executive order on artificial intelligence just hours before a planned White House event. Trump said he was worried the order could dull US's edge on AI technology. Here's the president in his own words.
I didn't like certain aspects of it. I postponed it. I think it gets in the way of, we're leading China, we're leading everybody, and I don't want to do anything that's going to get in the way of that lead. We have a very substantial on AI. It's causing tremendous good. I really thought that could have been a blocker, and I want to make sure that it's not.
How could an executive order get in the way of US's advancement in artificial intelligence? Why would President Trump call off a major AI executive order? And what does it mean for US tech industry? We are speaking about this and also the geopolitics of AI with Sam Winter-Levy. He is a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Sam, before we speak to you, let's look at some of the details of the executive order. According to reports, tech companies would give the US government an early look at new AI models before the release. This would allow government agencies to check for dangerous capabilities and vulnerabilities. The order would also bolster cybersecurity in the US. Sam, explain to us a bit more what's the idea behind this bill on AI?
Sure, yeah. So the idea behind this order has been prompted by this increasing concern that the latest generation of artificial intelligence models are growing increasingly powerful. And so the government would like to have a little bit more visibility, a little bit more oversight, and a bit more control over the release of those models. In particular, the release of one of Anthropic's latest models called Mythos prompted these fears in the government that these models could be capable of extremely sophisticated cyber attacks, a range of risks to critical infrastructure. And so the idea behind this executive order was that the government would like a little bit more visibility into these models before they're released.
And we will speak a bit more about Mythos, but I want to ask you, why do you think the US president has for now called off this executive order?
So the short answer is we don't know exactly. I think for the last few weeks, the White House has been divided over how best to respond to these models. There are some camps who want the government to have a much more assertive role over what these companies are capable of doing, to have a lot more visibility into what these models can produce. There are other camps who still lean towards a more deregulatory approach to this. They don't want the government to be taking a very heavy-handed role in the tech industry. And I think those divisions are continuing to play out. We don't know exactly. President Trump, as you saw in that clip, didn't say exactly what his objections to the order were. But I think these internal divisions about how best to respond to this technology will continue to play out in the coming days and weeks.
And tell us, if implemented, what would be the major changes we will see?
So the major change in this order would be that companies would have to give the government, there's some debate over exactly what it would look like. It would probably be voluntary initially, at least, but companies would have to give the government several weeks to a few months' notice of models that they had, models that they were preparing to release. And so that would give the government time to assess the model's capabilities, to work with local governments, state governments, critical infrastructure providers, the financial industry, the grid, the electricity companies, to try to figure out what these models were capable of and to try to patch any vulnerabilities that those models could expose. And so the idea would be that the government would not necessarily have a veto on what models can be released, but they would have a little bit more awareness of what these models' capabilities are. And so companies would, instead of just choosing on their own whether or not to release a model, they would have to run their new models by the government. And again, initially it would be voluntary, but I think part of the fear would be that this would be the beginning stages of a licensing process where the government could approve the release of frontier models as companies train them.
So a bit more oversight from the government. Sam, if ever implemented, this executive order would really represent a change of strategy for Donald Trump on AI, right? Initially, he wanted to deregulate AI. His election victory was helped by tech leaders who said President Biden was too heavy-handed with his AI regulation. Once Donald Trump was in office, he removed the guardrails passed by Biden and made a bold prediction.
America is the country that started the AI race. And as President of the United States, I'm here today to declare that America is going to win it. We're going to work hard. We're going to win it.
So that was a very clear statement. So how did Trump even came close to signing this executive order?
Yeah, so like you said, the Trump administration has pursued quite a deregulatory approach in general to the tech industry. They've been very skeptical of regulation of these companies. They've gone out of their way to try to accelerate the adoption of the technology. But as you say, this executive order could have marked quite a significant change and could still mark quite a significant change. And it's a move towards the government giving green lights to companies on when they're allowed to release models. I think the major driver of this change was just this increasing realization of the capabilities these models are capable of, the powers that these models have. So I mentioned this Anthropic model, Mythos, but in general, it's not just this model. In general, a lot of these companies are increasingly releasing models that have very serious national security implications. Their capabilities in the cyber domain, potentially down the road in the bio domain, in their abilities to come up with new biological weapons, are just very, very powerful. And so increasingly, the government is realizing that it may need to at the very least, have a lot more information about what these models are capable of, if not play a slightly more assertive role in what these companies are allowed to release on the open market.
And do you think the tech bosses of the companies that are releasing these AI models, have they been pushing Trump to stop this bill?
I think we don't know exactly. I think the companies in general are divided on many of these issues. I think in general there is support from at least some of the companies that the government should be playing an important role here. The companies themselves have been calling for increased oversight of some of their capabilities because they can see what these models are capable of. Of course, they're also locked in a kind of competitive race with the other companies, so they don't want any step that could slow them down relative to their competitors. Different companies have staked out different positions on this, but I think in general there is some appetite from the companies, not for the government to be able to kind of block their model releases, but for the government to have a little bit more information about what these models are capable of. So I think the companies are kind of playing they're in a complicated position right now.
So let's bring in the AI company Anthropic here. You've mentioned their AI model Mythos. In April, the company announced that it has built this new AI model called Claude Mythos, which they claim is too powerful to be released to the public. Anthropic said that Mythos is capable of outperforming humans in certain hacking and cybersecurity tasks. Sam, tell us if Anthropic's announcement had anything to do with what's happening to the AI bill now?
Yes, I think it absolutely did. So Anthropic released this new model, trained this new model, Mythos, as you said, several weeks ago. That model is capable, according to Anthropic, but also according to some independent evaluations, for example, from the British government's AI Security Institute, that model is capable of very sophisticated cyber attacks. There is debate about exactly how powerful it is, but it's clearly a very impressive model that could pose a wide range of risks to banks, to local hospitals, to local governments, to critical infrastructure in general, if it falls into the hands of bad actors. And we know that there are bad actors out there who are committing cyber attacks every day. So Anthropic did not release this model broadly. They released it to a smaller group of private companies and gave them a window in which they could work with those companies to try to patch these vulnerabilities, to shore up their defenses. The release of that model and the capabilities that it has, I think, has triggered a shift in the White House and a shift in the government towards realizing these capabilities are here, whether they like it or not, and they're just going to have to play a more aggressive role in regulating them, in overseeing them, because if they do nothing, if they just allow these models to be released on the open market, that could lead to really quite serious cyber attacks, accidents that could have major economic consequences, potentially major national security consequences.
Sam, for our viewers, can you explain a bit more what negative consequences would we see if they're publicly available, these AI models?
Sure. So if you think about a model like Mythos, this latest release from Anthropic, it's capable of pulling off very sophisticated cyber attacks that in the past only a very small number of extremely skilled humans could do. So maybe the intelligence community of the United States could pull off these cyber attacks, but your average criminal could not. If you suddenly give this type of capability to organized crime groups, to hostile states, then you could expose all sorts of parts of your society to cyber attacks of a scale and a sophistication that they haven't been able to prepare for. So if you think about local hospitals that suddenly are crippled by a cyber attack, in exchange for a ransom. Or if you think about banking, the banking industry being exposed to cyber attacks to steal money from accounts. If you think about phone communications infrastructure that suddenly that goes down, or the grid, the electrical grid that gets taken out by a terrorist group or a hostile state. And the US government, of course, is also worried not just about non-state actors, but about adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, getting access to these types of capabilities. And so those are some of the reasons why Anthropic said, maybe eventually we'll release it, but first we want to only release it to big companies who can shore up defenses. So that we use this window of opportunity while we're in the lead to try to use these systems to improve our defenses before we release it more broadly to a wider range of actors.
Okay, that explains also a bit of push for a more oversight on AI models. Sam, Trump says he didn't sign the order because he doesn't want to hold the US back in the AI race against China. How close is that race with China?
Yeah, so as you saw, President Trump cited the reason the costs of slowing down may be quite severe because the US is locked in this race with China. Right now, I think in general, the general consensus is that at least when it comes to frontier models, so these most advanced AI models, the United States has a lead. Exactly how big that lead is unclear. Several months, anything from 2 months to 6 months to 9 months. It's not exactly clear, but the United States has a clear lead. The world's best models right now are all being trained by US companies, but Chinese companies are not far behind. The US right now has a significant lead when it comes to access to advanced chips. So the hardware that you use to train these models, the chips that are designed by companies like NVIDIA and TSMC in Taiwan, the US has quite a significant lead there. But China has a lot of other strengths. They have a lot of access to energy, which is what you need to use to train these models. They have great companies of their own. They have a lot of talented researchers. So I think in general, the race is certainly close. There are multiple races taking place simultaneously, not just the race to design the best models, but also to adopt them in your military and in your economy more broadly. And I think right now it's really too early to call a winner. But for now, the United States has a lead, but it's narrow.
And the US and China, the world's largest military powers, are also at the center of the competition of artificial intelligence-backed weapons and military systems. Does that get impacted by a future potential US set of rules on AI?
Absolutely. So artificial intelligence is this general purpose technology. It's this dual use technology that's going to be very valuable for economic activity, for civilian research, for scientific research, but it also is going to be very valuable in the military and for the intelligence community, both because of its cyber capabilities, but also because of its use in finding targets and accelerating targeting cycles. If you're the military and you want to find out where Iran's missiles are, artificial intelligence models can be very useful for that. So both countries are clearly racing to adopt this technology into their military as well. We've seen the use of these AI systems in the US's campaign against Iran. Now, whether this particular regulation would actually have slowed down the US in any meaningful way, I think that's unclear. At least as far as we know, this executive order would primarily have given the government a little bit more visibility into the model's capabilities. So it wouldn't necessarily have slowed down the US in any significant way. And in fact, if a model were to be released prematurely and then lead to a terrible accident, that could actually slow the US down more. So the exact nature of whether this executive order would have slowed the US down, I think that's probably a somewhat implausible claim.
Okay.
But in general, heavy regulation could slow the US down, and so there are national security costs to that as well.
Sam, I'm curious to know when it comes to weapons and also, nuclear weapons, do countries have their own AI policies, or is there a push for an international body that oversees, especially when it comes to use of AI in weapons?
So in general, there is not a huge amount of regulation here. The United States and China have managed to agree to some very narrowly limited agreements on the use of AI, particularly when it comes to its use in nuclear command and control. So the countries have, there's generally agreement that you don't want AI systems making decisions about the launch of nuclear weapons. Beyond that, there are efforts by various multilateral organizations. There are certainly rules around some of the use of AI in military systems, but in general, their states have been much more hesitant to bind their own hands. We're seeing, in Ukraine and Russia, this very rapid cycle of innovation as both sides try to develop new drones, new systems to run those drones. And so for now, I think the regulation around the use of AI in the military is pretty limited when it comes to major powers that are competing with each other.
And here in Europe, we are seeing a more cautious approach generally when it comes to the use of AI. There's a lot of push for more regulations and oversight. Earlier this week, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel urged EU lawmakers to regulate AI even more strongly. Have a listen.
I can only encourage all of you. Continue along the path of regulating these social or supposedly social media. Continue along the path of regulating artificial intelligence. Mistakes may be made, yes. But to believe that accountability for the dissemination of information is no longer necessary, that one will not be held to account for lies, will undermine the foundations of democracy.
Das wird die Grundlagen der Demokratie untergraben.
Sam, why do you think Europe is taking a more cautious approach than the US?
So I think in general, Europe has taken a more regulatory approach to a broad range of technologies, not just artificial intelligence, but social media companies, the internet in general. And I think we're seeing a continuation of that when it comes to AI. The EU AI Act was one of the world's first comprehensive AI regulations. The EU in general has viewed one tool in its arsenal as its ability to try and set rules that other companies around the world will have to comply with, often known as the Brussels effect. So in general, I think the EU has a much less kind of laissez-faire approach to technology, and we're seeing a continuation of that when it comes to AI.
But still, when it comes to AI, it's the US and China that are leading the race. Sam, tell us how any change in AI regulations in the US could impact the EU.
Yeah, so right now, it's really primarily a two-horse race when it comes to AI. The US and China are leading the way, and that's because a lot of the inputs that you need to train these models, huge amounts of chips, huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of capital, are really concentrated in the United States and China to some extent. The Europeans have struggled with higher energy prices. It's hard to build these really big data centers quickly. So a lot of Europe has fallen quite far behind in the race. There are still some great companies in Europe. France has a company called Mistral, which is very good. Britain has a lot of talented researchers. So it's not the case that no one else has access, but it is the case that the US and China are leading the way right now. And that means that if you're a European country, if you're a middle power elsewhere, you are in this difficult position where you may have to end up choosing between US technology or Chinese technology if you want access to the world's best models. And that means that you're very vulnerable to changes in US government policy. So for instance, if the US government were to introduce some sort of regulation or some sort of law that gave the US government the authority to approve who could access these models or when these models could be released, that could have major implications for countries around the world that use these models and that they don't have any say in setting that policy. So I think the power of these new models and the government's increasing willingness to kind of flex its muscles here just highlights the vulnerability that the rest of the world may face when it comes to their access to the world's best AI systems.
So EU or other countries could potentially in future be working on their own AI models to lessen their dependence on US and China?
Yeah, I think they're in a very difficult position because they may have less access to the advanced US models. At the same time, it's very hard for them to train their own models. The scale of the resources that you need, the amount of data, the amount of talent, the amount of energy, the amount of chips, which themselves are controlled by the US and a small group of other countries, the amount of those inputs that you need to train frontier models is very demanding. So it's not as, even if you wanted to train your own sovereign model, your own frontier model, if you're the Europeans or if you're India, that's a very difficult proposition for them. So I think they are making moves to try to build up some of their own domestic capabilities. Whether those moves will lead to models that are as good as the ones coming out of America and China, I think is very uncertain. These countries can also try to strike deals with the US. They can negotiate with the US to try to guarantee access to the best American models in exchange for market access or in exchange for key inputs to the semiconductor supply chain. So if you want access to some of the machines that the Dutch can produce that can make the advanced chips, then maybe the Dutch could try to negotiate for access to advanced US models. But in general, a lot of these countries are in a very difficult position because they're going to need this technology. It's very hard for them to make it on their own, and the US government may be increasingly controlling who can access it.
Sam Winter-Levy, Fellow in the Technology and International Affairs Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And what do you think? What caused Trump's sudden change of heart when it comes to regulating AI companies? And could a future bill have a far-reaching impact on how their technology could be used? Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.